As an artist, something I struggled with a lot early on was to do with style. I wanted to, on the one hand, have a painted style, and on the other hand, I wanted to have more of a line and color, a cartoony style. I also wasn't really sure whether I wanted to make things realistic or exaggerated. How much style did I actually want? One of the biggest things that was making all of this problematic was that I didn't truly understand how to leverage form versus shape. The concepts of a painted style or a comic book style, realism versus cartooniness, I think are often intermingled with this concept of, are we rendering a lot of form? How much lighting actually goes into our style? And how does that affect the viewer? How does that affect what we actually have to say? Often in the beginning, a lot of our style is actually limited by and defined by our technical ability. And we often make choices about what our style should or could be based on what we perceive as being easy or what we can actually do right now. You can also lay on top of that the fact that we frequently value some styles of art or forms of art more than others because they seem more technically challenging, because they require more craft from us. Often, we think that a rendered style or a painted style or the ability to draw realistically or whatever it may be is better. It's more valuable, or at least that's how it can seem to someone who is just starting their artistic journey. One of the concepts that really allowed me to tease out these different elements of style is the concept of form versus shape. And what I want to do in this video is share with you my journey to understanding that and getting better at mastering the different aspects and ways of creating images through sort of comic books and illustration, concept art, etc. And hopefully through sharing my journey, you can understand a little bit about how these concepts might apply to your style and your journey. As usual for a Drawing Codex video, this is going to be neither fast-paced nor heavily edited. It's just going to be you and me in Photoshop. I'll share with you a bunch of images that I've created over the years. I think this is a really interesting, important concept to get your head around, especially if you're interested in a heavily stylized way of working. You want to get into concept art, comics, illustration, etc. And again, you really want to make sure that your style says something unique. So hopefully that sounds interesting. Hopefully you'll join me. Let's jump in and get started. Alright, welcome to the Drawing Codex. My name is Tim McBurney. I've been a professional working artist for over 20 years, and on this channel, we're all about drawing cool stuff from our imagination, embracing the challenge of drawing, and mastering the craft of line and color illustration. Now, if you'd like to learn more about illustration and picture making, you can check out my free illustration mini workshop. It charts my journey going from an amateur to a professional, and I talk a lot about really important issues such as how to get more detail and polish in your work, how to plan your images, create thumbnails, and also a few thoughts on how to approach being a professional artist. As I said, it's free. The link will be in the description. Go check it out if that's something you're interested in. Okay, so here I have a whole bunch of images. But before we really get into the meat of this session, let me just go over the basic concept of form versus shape. And this really comes down to thinking about how much lighting or light showing form, and really that being the fundamental thing that you look at and perceive as you view the image, how much that affects the viewer. So as I sort of have talked about in a previous video where I really unpacked this, here's two images that I've created. They're both essentially the same subject matter. One feels like it has the lights on. It's mostly focused on shape and object, whereas the other one is much more about the lighting. The lighting is kind of how we perceive the form in this bottom image, whereas here we're primarily perceiving the form and understanding what's going on just by sort of looking at the sort of drawing and there's different shapes involved. And I sort of talked about in that video how this isn't something that's related to styles that are in comics or illustration. This goes across the entire way that people perceive images and understand the world. So I talked about how in something like Ridley Scott's Blade Runner, you have much more of a film noir style form-based rendering, a way of understanding the world that is based on the light. And we perceive these frames in Blade Runner, and we really sort of understand, here's another one from Alien, the form and what's going on through the lighting. Different elements of the face are lit, different elements are in shadow. We have cast shadow, form shadow, and your brain is obviously able to perceive that and put together this feeling of form. But that's not the only way that we perceive the world. We also frequently perceive the world through shapes. And just kind of without a lot of direct lighting on something, we can tell that obviously people have features, they have expressions, and that this is a different way of sort of representing the world that maybe sometimes feels a little bit less dramatic in some ways, but more dramatic in others. And that this is often the building blocks that make up style, right? So classically, you often would have cartoony imagery that has a very sort of shape-based way of sort of putting pictures together that doesn't rely on really understanding the form or looking at the form that much. There obviously is form underneath that, but primarily the way people perceive it is through sort of different shapes around there, as opposed to something that is form-based, where you're really looking at the lighting and you have a face that is made up of dark and light elements, but you can understand what's going on. So when I started out, I really had no idea that this was even a thing. And the best way for me to sort of describe what I was doing early on then is I was kind of just bouncing around, right? I didn't have a strong idea of what I was doing, and I'd be creating work that would be like this, where it's very much based on these kind of graphic shapes. There's not a lot of rendering. There's not a lot of really kind of pushing the form. And it's mostly just very sort of flat, cartoony. People often view this as a cartoony style, a simplified style. I think those words though aren't that sort of helpful because again, you can often have very, very different styles that are both sort of cartoony or realistic, and it's better to sort of view this with more nuance. But one of the things that I would constantly be, I guess, confused about was how this actually works. And I kind of wanted to make stuff that was both cartoony and also painted at the same time. And I was attaching these different ideas to it. The idea of painted, rendering being much more about it being brushy. And I'd often be trying to think, because I'd be learning a lot about painting, that the more you understand form, the better your painting is. And I would constantly be trying to add more form through rendering. And I didn't have a good sort of understanding of the difference between sort of rendering and drawing and how these things go together to sort of make an image. So for instance, I would have an image like this, which I did quite a while ago, I think. Sort of in 04. So sheesh, literally 20 years ago. And I felt this one actually worked out really well. This is one of these things I did early on. And I had this sort of interesting, I liked the brushiness that you could often get with skies where you could really paint them. I didn't always want to sort of draw clouds or anything like that. I liked the idea of being able to paint that. I obviously liked cartoony characters. But one of the interesting things here is that, yeah, I was always trying to, I guess, sort of add more rendering. But most of the images that worked for me, and I think this is the key, didn't work based on their rendering. So I was trying to add the rendering in, but I really think that in most cases, if I had just made these colors completely flat, the image would have worked anyway. So typically where I was having success, and again, there is a bit of survivorship bias here because I'm showing you the images that worked, not the ones that didn't. But this is a good example where I think I was trying to add a lot of shading. And what that means is I was trying to say, where's the light and the dark side of the form? I was trying to add that. But there's a degree to where a lot of the style that I was using really sort of existed more on a shape-based level, which is to say that this image primarily succeeds not on its rendering, but just on the sort of interesting shapes and the characters, the story, the narrative. And I think just not really understanding that made me waste a huge amount of time because I was always thinking more rendered is better. It shows more craft, it shows more technique. And I was often being told, hey, your stuff is not realistic enough, or it's not finished enough, it's not polished enough. And I was sort of in my mind mixing up the ideas of rendered and detailed and realistic. And all these things kind of were sort of one conglomerated thing. And I couldn't really sort of piece them out. And this was sort of obviously contrasted by the fact that I really enjoyed more cartoony styles like Tintin and Asterix. That's kind of what I grew up with. But yeah, I just kind of viewed more renderedness as being better. And I think that was kind of really sort of blocking me early on. And I've sort of talked about some of these. If you've watched other sort of videos in this type of series and format talking about my journey, you've probably seen a couple of these images. But when I first kind of got to do comics, I ended up sort of doing a bit of a mix of everything. I had pencil drawings that I was coloring in Photoshop. And you can see I've sort of got this mix of, okay, here's a drawing, and these are all primarily succeeding based on just having different flat shapes, essentially. We've got very clear delineation between the sort of jacket, the face, the hair. These are all very much more in that Wes Anderson style of rendering. And I think a lot of the stuff, again, I'm showing you is stuff where I feel like I got it to work. But the real challenge I was having was understanding like how much rendering to add. And often I would find that the more I sort of added shadows and highlights, and I really sort of pushed that, the worse it got. And I think this just comes down to that fundamental observation that I was sort of trying to really sort of get across to you, is that fundamentally, if you're making an image that's based on light and dark, that's when you can put in more highlights, more shadows. You can really sort of push those things. And I would constantly be trying to push everything that way. But the more I did, the worse it looked. And I think always I would sort of end up with something where I'd be adding highlights, but I would always have to back off on it, because I felt that, again, the more actual rendering I did, the worse it got. And that's because if I sort of look back, really, again, the style was functioning less on the rendering and more just on one shape versus another. And if I understood that at the time, I would have been able to better sort of render these things. Because what they need is similar to those, again, going back to those more cartoony open styles, is yes, we render everything. Yes, we do push the form, but very subtly, because primarily this is not about seeing very intense shadows and highlights on a character's face. It's mainly a matter of sort of isolating the different shapes of the character and just letting the viewer understand things that way. So this is something that I was just completely unaware of at the time, and it took me a long process to really sort of get better at it. And I feel like I was often not necessarily getting the best out of either painting things and adding rendering, adding shadows, adding highlights, and again, just being able to lean on the sort of shapes. And I think not understanding how important shape is and how important and effective just using different blocks of colors and objects and just sort of laying off the rendering, it kind of meant that things were just a little bit confused, and I was just putting effort into essentially the wrong space. And so this is like a good example of how I feel like I was getting things to work, but I was definitely a little bit confused, So if we sort of zoom in, I was adding a few highlights, a few shadows, really trying to sort of get that working. But often I wasn't able to really sort of push that as much as I maybe should, because I was actually sort of cutting against how the style worked in the first place, which is just, as I said, shapes, and making sure the lines help define everything. So here's an example of a marketing illustration that I did in a similar time frame. And you can see that often this is one of the struggles that you will get into, is being asked to make things more rendered or add more contrast. And I was adding more contrast, I was adding more rendering, but I didn't really have a good understanding of exactly where the lighting would be or how it should function. And also my style didn't really work based on rendering that much. It worked much more on a shape level. I was interested in cartooniness, really sort of big shapes. And often I was sort of just stuck a bit in the middle in terms of thinking, okay, how do I solve this problem? Do I add more rendering? Do I refine the shapes? And I think also when you're beginning, you are really trying to render everything and think very much about the lighting scenario. And I just wasn't able to do that because the entire style I was using didn't really work with that anyway. There is an element where you're not really so interested in exactly where all the lighting is. if you're working with a more sort of cartoony style, because I think the focus should be more on how do you actually communicate and sort of show that character the best. And I think you're already not really focused on reality. And so the more you can push into fantasy and just making sure things are clear and fun, the better. So again, this is like a good example of where often I was kind of pulling it together, but and I think people have commented in the past, like it really sucks for me to kind of say, I often am looking at this whole work and I'm saying like, it wasn't quite there, it wasn't quite professional enough, because again, maybe your work is not there and it's sort of frustrating to hear that. Again, a lot of this and a lot of what I define as like being professional is just that when I was doing these things, I wasn't struggling with it quite so much. So in the beginning, when I was doing these types of illustrations, I'd be struggling a lot. So I'd kind of figure out some way to do it, but it was a real struggle for me to figure out how to make the image work. And I often felt like it was a failure because I wasn't making it as realistically rendered or something like that. Whereas the more I've progressed, the more I feel like I understand those things. I create the work. Maybe it's not that much better, but the professionalism that I feel as I'm doing it makes a big difference. And my ability to deliver to a client something that is sort of what they ask is also part of professionalism. So it doesn't often define the quality of the work, just the feeling of going through it. So here's another example where I was starting to blend these two and try and create this kind of style that was part line and color, part sort of rendered. Here we got what is a very, very rough painted sort of background where we've got this kind of forest god guy here. This kind of printed okay, but yeah, to me now it looks very, very rough. But I think when you sort of zoom out, when it was all printed, it kind of worked right. But looking at it now, yeah, it was just kind of mostly round brush, very, very sort of rough, but it kind of worked. And yeah, here's an example where I'm sort of mixing the two. And I think this is where starting to understand that it's not necessarily a matter of right and wrong. It's just a matter of kind of what works, like what is going to sort of look cool. There's probably a bunch of things that I feel like if I understood that even better, I could start to push and really sort of move forward on a little bit more. But this is an example where the characters are not really lit in any magical way. They're lit in a very sort of flat way. And the character in the background, though, that's part of the background, has a light source that makes a little bit more sense, right? The light is kind of coming from above, casting a shadow down, and all this stuff is, again, sort of very, very sort of roughly painted. But you're starting to see an impact where the backgrounds have some sense of the light being a major part of the style, whereas the characters sort of don't. And I think it was just getting the confidence to play around with that really sort of helped me. But still, I think I was sort of viewing it as like, this is good or this is bad. And I actually spent quite a bit of time, probably around the time when I was working on the Pinocchio book. That's when I sort of really started to get more into perspective and rendering. And I started to teach perspective and rendering. And it was these things that sort of helped me to take my work to the next level. But it's interesting how often learning more rendering and more perspective puts a focus on rendering and perspective into our work. So I sort of got a little bit better at doing a lot of drawing stuff, right? A lot more sort of form, a lot more structure. And you can see that I've sort of landed on a style where with Pinocchio, similar to Seven Pirates, but I think, again, the difference is I was more comfortable with this, is that I have shadows, I'm showing form, but it's very subtle. Mostly you just view these characters as being cartoony, and there are shadows, but it's not like the shadow really affects the shape, if that makes sense. And I think that's often the big difference. And it really just is a matter of understanding how much contrast you're putting into the forms, the form shadow, cast shadow, all of those things, versus just letting the shapes read by themselves. So there's a lot of rendering here, but none of it is really affecting the sort of look of the characters that much. It's just sort of adding some sort of sense of what the form is. But never in any of these am I really playing up any sense of lighting, right? So for instance, in this one, it's really not clear where the lighting's coming from. it's really not clear in any of these where the lighting's coming from, except for kind of down, right? So lighting's always coming from down. We just have some general sort of lighting, and similar to cartoony look, it just kind of feels as if everyone's just kind of in their own sort of weird lighting scenario. And I just sort of push characters back, push some characters forward, and that's kind of how we get everything working. Some of the backgrounds have more rendering, but again, none of it is that realistic. And again, this was because at that time, I was starting to put a lot of effort into, really sort of getting good at not just doing rendering in perspective, but also teaching rendering in perspective. And I just did a huge amount of study on elements of light, basic rendering, perspective, and, doing this kind of stuff where we draw cars, we draw all sorts of things, and you have to sort of render them all and figure out the perspective and the proportion and do it all from scratch, right? The fire and brimstone method of sort of teaching. And so I think I sort of got to a good place with it. But again, around that time, I was also starting to try and say, well, okay, maybe this is how I want my style to go. Maybe I actually want to add more rendering. And the thing that once you really start looking at good painting that has a good sense of light and shadow, where the primary dominant thing that you're doing as you're looking at the image is thinking about the lighting scenario and what that says about it, is that you really come to the conclusion that you need interesting lighting setups. And the more interesting lighting setup there is, probably the more interesting the image is going to look like to a certain degree. And so I really started to, play into that and experiment with like, okay, let's draw something. And I sort of developed a style and technique that was a bit of a mix of sort of painting and drawing. And it gave me the ability to kind of explore some of these concepts. And I used a lot of this stuff when I did concept art, trying to mix the ideas of, yes, I'm drawing, yes, I'm working in a line and color style, but it's painted. This was probably one of the sort of earlier examples of that. Here was some other sort of experiment style things where, yes, it's kind of cartoony, but you can see in this case, I really am trying to get a feeling of light. We've got reflected light, sort of ambient light. We got more ambient occlusion. We got this kind of rim light here. And, it's very rough, but, the effect is sort of interesting. And I was trying to sort of paint the backgrounds a little bit more. But I think the real challenge here was I didn't know what I wanted to do with my style that much. And I'd sort of done Pinocchio. And yeah, I sort of got better at, you can see these are all sort of from that time frame, like 2015, something like that. And I was still trying to sort of inject a lot of lighting to the images that I was creating. And this was helping me a lot with concept art, because often concept art is a matter of prototyping lighting scenarios and sort of figuring out how things work. So I can't show any of that because most of the concept art I've done is NDA, but you're getting sort of a hint of sort of what I was working at. And here's another sort of image that obviously I've showed this before on the channel. You can see this on my ArtStation. And this is me really trying to sort of work with the idea of, okay, can I get better at lighting? And I think this is the most interesting aspect of it to me, is mixing up the idea of what is better versus what is worse and what is style. And often feeling like if you're choosing a style, like I sort of was, that didn't have a lot of this rendering, but I was in environments artistically where rendering was very valued, right? So all of the workshops that I was going to, all of the workshops that I was teaching were sort of teaching people how to do fundamental art. And a lot of that is based on rendering, shading, etc. and trying to get our ability to kind of do, like paint from life, draw from life, understand how to represent the world realistically. And so I was just doing a lot of that. And kind of, I sort of got into this frame that like, that's better, right? And I think this is where the more freedom you have, the more you can start to sort of experiment. So here's something from, I think this is probably actually 2011, so a little bit earlier. Again, trying to work with sort of very stylized painted styles, sort of blockiness, but just sort of mixing things up a little bit, trying to find out what I was going to sort of do. Because again, in case it's not clear, this sort of style indecision is something that has sort of plagued me for a long time. And I think mostly it's because I was struggling with a lot of these issues. So there was a lot of this kind of experimentation, right? And here's another one of these sort of technical demos where we draw, I think P38 lightning. Got to draw it in perspective, from scratch, and then sort of color it and render it. This is a sort of rendering where I sort of mix and show the different sort of things you're doing. But yeah, a lot of sort of hardcore technical stuff that helped a lot. And again, if I just sort of stuck to my very sort of stylized Seven Pirates book, like I don't think I would have got as much work as a concept artist because I didn't have the technical ability to really be as versatile as I needed. But yeah, it was interesting how you can see here that a lot of the painting is kind of just very, like looking at it from a technical perspective, none of it makes that much sense, but yet it was effective. And I think a lot of it's effective because, again, the lights aren't on. The lights aren't off, right? I'm not really playing with realistic lighting, but that is actually something that mirrors a lot of filmic sort of cinematic styles, right? That don't actually have a lot of obvious lighting to them. They really aren't about that. So what it means is even though you may render something as an artist and it's way less accurate than a film would be, it doesn't matter because the thing you're looking at is not the rendering, it's not the lighting, it's kind of the shapes and the characters. And so there's an interesting sort of mix here where I was sort of trying to combine things. And I think I did get good. This is probably one of the best sort of examples where I was really managing to kind of mix comic booky styles with rendering and really sort of looking at like what's like a high concept thing where can we paint images where the lighting is really a major part of the story, right? So making sure that the light is something that's designed in from the thumbnail. And this kind of has not a painted finish, but sort of a painted feel in terms of how the light actually affects everything. So this is a good example where the light is actually a major part of how we perceive the image and what's going on. Where we have some things are in shadow in the background. We've got this big sort of guy tied up. You don't kind of see him because he's kind of faded out. You see the character here in the foreground. We don't see this thing. This is like a secondary, tertiary read. We see this character primarily because she is a rimlet here against the dark, and that there is a good sort of silhouette pop from that character against the sort of lighter striations of the stairs. And again, that's all on purpose. I designed that all into the thumbnail. And so again, I was sort of experimenting with a lot of these different things. But a big part of it, I guess, sort of where I ended up was, just being more sort of comfortable with that kind of flat color style, despite, spending a lot of time sort of rendering. So again, this is a good example of where there's rendering there, and this kind of helps to, from a concept art perspective or whatever, make things feel a bit more rendered. You can push and pull a bit more texture, but fundamentally, it's just shapes, right? It's a very sort of cartoony sort of look. And, that's something that I was sort of developing. And also, as I, took on some different projects that allowed me to experiment with this a bit more. I've talked about this project as well, the Mythic Arcana board game. And this, I think, was really where I started to say, okay, we can just kind of have fun with style, because style is something where we get to choose what we're going to add. And the real key here is that because I'd gotten better at rendering, and better at perspective and better at technical drawing, I was able to kind of step back and say, okay, but what would look good? So we got a couple of characters here where the lighting is like not coming from anywhere. And there's not a dominant feeling of like, okay, the light is casting shadows here, or you can often see like with a lot of art, if it's not very effective, if people don't really understand what they're doing, they'll kind of have a highlight here, a shadow here, but then you can tell that shadow, because that light is here, it should be casting a shadow over there, and it's not, and it kind of all looks like a mess. This was me kind of just saying, okay, let's have a very benign lighting setup, right? Light is kind of generally coming from above in a very vague way, but, it's almost as if these are just different shapes, right? I've just got one sort of shape, and it's all sort of rendered the same, and we're really playing much more with graphic design, one color on top of another, pattern, overlap, all of these different things. And I think this project really was one of the first times where I felt, again, it's not necessarily about the result, but I felt like I was able to play around with different ways of making images and kind of have fun, as opposed to just worrying, was my rendering good enough, right? Like was my was my sort of technical ability good? And I think this often happens if you don't have a good foundation, like I didn't in the beginning, is you feel deficient. And let me know in the comments whether this tracks, but you might feel deficient because you're not able to do something. But again, the question is, is that because you feel like you should be able to do it, or is it because you actually need to do it for your style? And I think this is where it gets so complicated. It's really important to know where you want to go in the beginning if you want to get there quicker, because there's an infinite amount of technical expertise that you can gain, and it never really ends. And it's mostly about at some point kind of making a choice, right? So who got sort of this is, I guess, sort of where I have sort of ended up recently, is really sort of going back to more of that sort of cartoony look for particular projects, and understanding that the style is more something that we do to fit a particular project that needs a particular style, and that often the way that we set up the art and what is and isn't going to happen in a particular rendering style can really affect the feeling of the project. So for the Star Atlas core comic book, I just went back to really kind of flat colors and simple kind of shapes. I made sure the drawing was as tight as possible, so all the perspective, I was trying to make sure that was all sort of working, trying to leverage as many elements of picture making, composition, foreground, middle ground, background, balance, right? All of the compositional rules you would have, color contrast, all that stuff, but just kind of saying, in this world, we don't have a lot of light and dark affecting things that much. It's mainly a matter of just sort of shapes. Everything's flat shaded. And I think just kind of saying that I would do that more as a choice versus feeling as if I did that, it would mean it's simpler or it's kind of not rendered or whatever, just sort of freed me up to make some of those decisions, and again, sort of create something that had a style that was sort of more challenging for me to sort of lean into earlier. And that's allowed me to create stuff that again leverages a more sort of graphic feel that doesn't necessarily have that sort of realistic rendering in terms of light or dark. It's more shape based, but again, that facilitates a lot of stylistic options in terms of storytelling and just how far you push things, right? Again, having this kind of bright orange background and making this really sort of graphic image here for a page would be very tricky if we were really trying to play up the light and dark of things. So yeah, hopefully that gives you a good idea of sort of where some of these different things can lead. I think that for me, the more cartoony style just allowed me to create stories that had that more sort of cartoony vibe, and we were able to explore a lot of sort of darker themes without making it feel as if this was too melodramatic or not fun. So again, often through style, you can bring up the level or bring down the level of sort of energy, or you can make things feel more fun, more like adventure, more like a cartoon, whatever you want to call it. And I think that can often, blending these things where you have subject matter, story, and the way it's sort of represented, can often give you very sort of interesting results. And I think not getting past the point where you feel like, okay, something's right or wrong, it's just a matter of a choice, I think is a really sort of good place to be. And again, that's why I sort of keep talking about a lot of these fundamental elements of picture making. And again, it's not to say that I think the final kind of end result of the style or anything that I'm sort of doing will be one thing or another. But I think through understanding the difference between form-based styles and sort of shape-based styles, it allows me to work in one or the other, or sort of anywhere in between. So hopefully that gives you a couple of ideas about maybe how you may be viewing your style. And I think especially the key insight here for me is just often we link up what we can do, what we see other people doing, and what is hard, what is easy, both for us and what we sort of perceive as being like higher value. I think often if you are just someone who is kind of developing your own art, this is kind of how I was. I was just kind of making things and trying to make my art better. I didn't have any formal training. I didn't have people saying like, hey, we're going to draw, sort of boring technical stuff for years and years. And, you got to learn this. I was just kind of figuring it out on my own. And I had a lot of, I guess, doubt about my abilities and what I sort of should be doing and what was good. And I think it's just so important to understand the role that style has, and often the way that in the beginning, we often might have natural proclivities towards either rendering or thinking in terms of shape, thinking in terms of form. You have things that may just be, it may be a crutch, it may be a weakness, it may be something where like, no, you need to double down, you need to learn this stuff. But often I think we sort of luck our way into, we find our way naturally into things that suit our personality and our artistic proclivities. And it's important to respect and appreciate that and not always feel like because there's something that we can't do, like again, more technical art, more technical craft, that's something you absolutely need. The more that you can develop your craft and develop your technical ability, the more options you'll get, the more freedom you'll get. I think the more creative opportunities you'll have. It often means it's a little bit easier to get different types of work as well, and it will make your life a lot easier and more fun because you can handle all of those challenges. But fundamentally, it's important to appreciate sometimes we kind of just luck into and find, as I think I sort of did early on, some things that actually did work really well for me. And I think that, often we can just get a little bit sort of twisted by, worrying about whether we're sort of good or not, as opposed to worrying about, like, are people liking our work? Are we getting a good response? And, just sort of worrying about the core thing, which is, the stories we're telling. Again, do people like our work? What's the emotion that we're able to get across? It's often those things that are more important than, are we reaching some kind of technical bar? Although, as I said, the more technical you can get with your mastery of artistic craft, the more options you have, the more career opportunities you'll probably have, and the easier your life will be day to day, because you can kind of work in different styles and work in sort of different processes. So anyway, let me know if you've got any thoughts on this one, how this relates to your style, what you may have sort of thought about, whether you're sort of good or not because you can or can't do something, whether you're wanting to, improve your technical rendering, improve your technical perspective, or again, whether you're going to sort of lean into style. Be really keen to know what you think. Other than that, catch you around. Happy drawing.